Katie Barnes is an award-winning journalist for ESPNW.com, ESPN.com, and ESPN the Magazine, covering culture, LGBTQ issues, women's basketball, collegiate softball, and women's combat sports. Since joining ESPN in 2015, Katie has written on a variety of topics, such as transgender athletes, campus sexual assault, sports leagues' incursion into public policy, racial justice, Hollywood stunt doubles, and whatever else the editor throws their way. Katie is a graduate of St. Olaf College and Miami University in Ohio. In addition to ESPNW.com, Katie has written online for Feministing, Outsports, Curve Mag, Ebony, and MTV News. Thank you so much for joining me today, Katie.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for your patience as we figure this out.
I think people understand. It is what it is, but we're glad that we can get you here to talk to us. So my first question for you is, the last 2 months and it has been tough for all of us. I think most people, specifically of color, are trying to make sense of the racial injustice and hate that we're seeing materialize. We obviously see it in real time on TV, and it's tough. I just want to kind of get a sense of how are you processing the reality of it all, and how are you coping?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think for me, I've leaned really hard on my chosen family and also my biological family. I went to school about 20 miles south of the Twin Cities in Minnesota. And so I have a lot of friends that have been on the ground sort of experiencing, the initial wave of activism and also violence that we've been seeing here in the United States. And, that part of it's hard. I think it's always hard whenever our communities that we feel a part of are targeted or look differently than what we expect them to, or experiencing challenging times. And, I think for every person of color, racism is not necessarily something new. I think what's new is the enormity of the response, which sometimes is both heartening and also deeply challenging. Some days I feel so grateful for the response of so many people who are not Black. And other times I'm like, man, what took you so long? And that, duality of feeling is something that I'm always balancing. But, I find that especially in these pandemic times when I can't get in my car and really drive anywhere, I don't really have anywhere to go. Honestly, I like to ride my horse on Red Dead Redemption 2 and live a life vicariously through a video game. And some days that's just what makes me feel better.
Yeah, we all have to do what we can to get some mental peace and find ways to just get through it. Thank you for sharing that. Can you take us back a little bit and talk about what it was like growing up in terms of finding your true identity, and really why was it basketball that you really connected to and found a safe space, a safe place?
Yeah, so I grew up in a really small town in Indiana, and that's like in the middle of the United States. And just a lot of cornfields, a lot of flat, open land, a lot of, honestly, like a lot of white people. My town was really small, like 1,500 people small. And I grew up as like one of the only, really, you have like families of Black people in town. And at any time, there were like maybe 2 families, maybe 3, I think I can think of when I was a little bit older. But so oftentimes, we were the only Black folks and usually the only people of color more broadly around. And that presented its own challenges when I was a kid. My parents made it very clear to me that I was brown and I was going to have a different experience than a number of my classmates. My dad is Black and my mom's white, for context. And so I had a number of conversations with my dad in particular about what being Black meant. He gave me a big talk right before I went to kindergarten, for example, about how to deal with people not really liking me for reasons I couldn't change. And what's funny, I suppose, about that conversation is I went to school and I was wearing my Spider-Man shoes, and my dad and I got teased mercilessly for them and was called a boy for wearing these like Spider-Man Velcros. And I came out to talk to my dad and after school and told him that I had met some of the people he was talking about, and he was like all geared up, ready to go and ready to fight everyone. And I told him the story, and he was like, "Oh, well, if you like Spider-Man, like that's fine. Like just like Spider-Man." And for me, I think with that, like I think back to that moment as a kid, and really, I think represents the intersection that I have lived at my whole life, which is even as a young child, I was bending gender. I had very supportive parents who would let me shop for clothes in the boys section whenever I wanted. And so all of that I found to be okay. But I mean, it was hard, right? And, especially as I got older and, even though I had the support of my parents, I found myself being policed by my classmates, especially girls, being told I needed to shave my legs. I needed to wear tighter clothing. It was no longer acceptable, really, to be a tomboy who like dressed in boys' clothes. Like I had to be a little girlier in order to fit in. And for me, I went along with that because I was already Black. And I was like, I don't really want to be too much different because the other stuff I can't really fix. But I can wear tighter jeans. That's a choice I can make. And so basketball became the place where I felt like I could really authentically express who I was. You can get away with wearing cutoff tees when you're playing basketball. You can, I could have more of a masculine expression. I could still buy like boys basketball shorts and it wouldn't be weird. So it sort of gave me this cover, especially in like late elementary and middle school, to really give, it just gave me a lot of space to like actually express what I was gender wise, even though I didn't really have the words to say that at the time.
And you describe yourself, or you'd like people to know that you see yourself as non-binary. For those who don't know what that term means, can you explain that? And also touch on, how can the sports industry expand on advocacy for people who are non-binary, gender fluid, or genderqueer?
Yeah, so when I use the word non-binary, I mean that I just sort of reject the notion of a gender binary, meaning man or woman. Neither one of those really fits how I describe myself. One of my favorite comedians, Rhea Butcher, who's also non-binary, describes that they identify with women, but not as a woman. And I really like that because as a person who's assigned female at birth, I do identify very much with women in terms of being critical of the patriarchy, in terms of wanting to center voices of those who are marginalized, et cetera, et cetera. So that's something that's interesting, but I have a more masculine expression. Non-binary, gender nonconforming, gender fluid, gender queer, those are all terms that describe similar rejections of the gender binary that folks may define a little bit differently for themselves if they identify that way. But in general, it's just kind of a not man or not woman catch-all, I suppose. And then in terms of what sports can do, for gender expansive people, sports creates it's a unique issue in that sports is binary. We have designed it to be binary. And so you have men's sports and you have women's sports, and that's where we are. And so if you are a non-binary person, fitting into that is really challenging, I think. And I think what's important is, I am personally not in favor of desegregating sports. I do think that we perhaps segregate a little too early in terms of like, I don't think we need to segregate 5-year-olds, right? Like, I don't really think we even need to segregate 9-year-olds. So I do think we do that a little bit too early, and that's detrimental to all athletes, especially actually women. But, I think that when it comes to thinking about how to better include folks who don't identify within the binary, a lot of it is about language. A lot of it is about being intentional with how we approach sports, with all the subtle messages within locker rooms, within sports that exist around gender expression. I think that is policed just as much in sports, especially in women's sports, but men's too, I suppose, as like just the ability to identify like one way or the other and having to play in a binary system. And so, in women's sports, you get a lot of like, let's go ladies. And I'm like, is everybody a lady? I don't know.
Yeah.
And so what ends up happening is like we create additional barriers and additional constraints within sports that don't have to exist, that are often language problems. And I think, if we get more intentional about that, that would be helpful.
So to stick on that theme, how can sports start to break away from the gender binary and create spaces that are inclusive for everyone?
Yeah, I think language is a really big thing. We use a ton of gendered language in sports, whether it's, let's go guys, let's go ladies, come on girls, et cetera, et cetera. There's an assumption that if you play in a specific category, that then you identify with all of the entrappings that come with that category. And that can be really hard, I think, for queer people broadly, but, even for, frankly, like cis people who just may not fit who may not also fit that description in the same way. And so we see those pressures in terms of like, are we creating a community or sporting environment where the expectation is that, we're going to have hairstyles a specific way that, reinforce long hair. I think like one example of this is in softball, where if you look at collegiate softball, so much of softball culture is wrapped up in how you do your hair. And so you have these long braids, you have these ponytails that have multiple ponies that go down that kind of look like horse manes. If that makes sense. It's like, I
know what you're talking about. Yeah.
It's like they call them like a horse pony. And it's like, and you have to really struggle and think like, is there anyone that plays top flight collegiate softball that has short hair? Like I can't name anyone right now. Doesn't mean they don't exist. But like, within that system, it's like, what then are what are the messages that are being sent? That's like a part of the culture. That's a part of the sporting ritual about what it means to participate in that culture, and how may that then be unintentionally or perhaps intentionally excluding other people. And that, makes it really difficult. I think about, someone that I wrote about a few years ago. His name is Lex Clay, and he played collegiate softball, and he's a transgender man, and he was out as trans to people, and this was like in 2008, like it was a long time ago. Yeah. And he was out as trans at the time to like close people, but not necessarily publicly. And I'm just like, man, that must have been so hard. Like, how do you have a masculine expression in a sport that prioritizes feminine expression almost exclusively? And like volleyball is another sport that's like that. Gymnastics is a sport that's like that. Figure skating, like when we have like these expectations and almost this compulsory femininity in a sport, like what does that do to folks who may not identify with that? And I think, that's something that's cultural, it's deeply ingrained. And of course, it's not just those sports. I mean, you can make the same argument for football and masculinity, for example. But, how I think it's really important to think about and assess where those cultures exist and how can we reimagine them to be more inclusive of all people who express themselves in all different ways and celebrate those varying expressions.
You touched a little bit on your colleague who's transgender. And, we see in sports news, most of the times, if you even Google current affairs for sports news, unfortunately, there's policies being passed. I know in the States, and you've heard about some of them globally, that are limiting transgender athletes from participating in sport. What more could be done around LGBTQ education in sport and building allyship for trans athletes, and those also who identify as non-binary?
I think when it comes to trans athletes, there's just a pervasive fear about what it means to have a transgender person competing. And this fear is almost exclusively placed upon transgender girls. So those people who are girls but were assigned male at birth, because, and I talked about this a little bit, but I think culturally when it comes to sport, we operate under a base assumption that any person who's assigned male at birth is going to be a better athlete than any person who's assigned female at birth. And it's a fundamentally sexist assumption, but it informs a lot of how we do policy and how we understand gender in sport. And I think it's really what informs the fear around transgender girls and women in particular competing. A lot of times, policy will be passed and trans guys will get kind of wrapped up into that policy, but oftentimes there is really no fear. It's actually like disbelief. Like, as somebody on the internet, people will tell me, well, show me a transgender guy who is competing with men and successfully. And I'm like, well, Chris Mosier, like he exists.
They ask the question before they do the research. Yeah, I know.
Yeah, right. But it's like, yeah. we have these people that do exist. And Chris Mosier is, I think, the best example, who is a elite athlete who competes in duathlon. He took 9th in the world in his age group a couple of years ago. He also competed in the Olympic trials in race walking in the men's category. And, he is an incredible athlete. But one of the things that he talks about is this assumption that he could not compete once he transitioned. And I think, that is the other side of the coin with this amount of fear that we see with transgender girls. And I live in Connecticut. And so a lot of times what people point to is the fact that we do have 2 transgender girls competing in Connecticut in track and who regularly win. One in particular, but Andrea Yearwood, who is the other athlete that competes and who competed in the girls category for the entirety of high school, she gets beat all the time. And I mean, she's very competitive, but she also loses races. And Terry Miller also will lose races, who's the other transgender girl. And so, it's one of those things that I think folks really have to sit with themselves and ask, why am I afraid of this? And then do some research about what policies exist and why is it that we only really know the names of transgender people when they're winning? Because that's the issue. It's like the narrative is that trans girls are going to come in and they're going to dominate. And so you can name maybe 3, 4, 5 transgender girls and women who have been in the news in recent years for winning and being successful. But Connecticut is one of 18 states that has this policy that allows for participation in sport in accordance with your gender identity without requiring medical or legal intervention in the form of surgery, hormones, or name or birth data or birth certificate changes. And yet the only 2 people that people can ever really name are Andrea Yearwood and Terry Miller. And statistically speaking, we know that about 2% of students, of teenagers of high school age identify as trans in the United States. We know that it's a small percentage, but somewhere between 10 to 15% of trans youth participate in sport. So by definition, statistically speaking, they're not the only 2. They just happen to be winning.
The one, and women are more visible in the news, as you said.
Exactly. So I think that is the biggest thing is that frankly, so there are a lot of trans athletes that are competing at the amateur levels across the United States. And they're not all winning. And we only really hear about it when they do. And I think that really informs a lot of this fear about what it means to have trans women in particular competing. And so I think it's really important on all of us to do the research and to educate ourselves and then also unlearn some of the bias that we have about assumptions about science. The science is still developing. It's still new. It's not nearly as settled as I think people think it is. And that's really important to know as well.
We look across pro sports. We see hockey is for everyone from the NHL, the WNBA, and MLB. I know dedicate a month for Pride. But we still hear that some athletes are facing barriers because of racism or anti-LGBTQ sentiment when they're in the sports space. What more can the sports industry do to instill a culture of equity and inclusion from, leading all the way from the front office to ensure things will change?
Yeah, I think most of the major sports leagues in the United States in particular have done a really great job in terms of addressing front office culture. league office culture. You know, there's a lot of policies in place. I mean, they've done almost as much as they possibly can, probably. I think one of the big things that, and like that next step, is looking at how are stadiums set up? Are they accessible for LGBTQ people?
The fan experience.
Yeah, it's like, are you openly and actively accommodating for queer people to be in your stands? Like, are there, you know, multi-stall, gender inclusive bathrooms available, like on a floor of the stadium? That would be dope. You know, it's one thing to say that you really care about queer people. When it comes to your social and corporate responsibility, are you donating to support, you know, organizations that support queer youth? Are you putting your money in organizations that are doing anti-racist work? And then also, are you holding your fans accountable? And I think that's the next step, is that when you look at, you know, corporate office culture, it's not acceptable to be using homophobic language in the workplace anywhere. And that also is true in sports. But when people talk about culture in sport, they're often talking about the culture in the stadium and the fans, and also in the locker room itself. And I think, you know, holding fans accountable is really important. And, you know, the stuff that happened in the NBA with Utah Jazz was really important in terms of, you know, banning those fans for life for using racist slurs. But oftentimes I think when we hear those stories about sports being intolerant around race, a lot of it is coming from what's shouted at the brown players in the stands, whether we're talking about, you know, the Premier League soccer, or we're talking about really all European soccer, or we're talking about, you know, NBA games and WNBA games, et cetera, et cetera. So all of those things, I think, really need to be examined, and it costs dollars. It's not necessarily popular to tell people that give you money that they can't come to the games if they're yelling bad things. And so that, to me, is that next step that really proves commitment. I don't know if in the current environment and climate we're going to get there soon, given all the hardships that everyone is facing economically. But it's my hope that as you know, we recover from the pandemic, that will be on the agenda in terms of actual, real, meaningful, sustained cultural change within all of sports culture, and not just how we talk to one another at the cubicles.
And what are your thoughts on athletes using their platforms to support social causes? We know Maya Moore has been in the news recently. Everybody knows, you know, what Colin Kaepernick is doing with his platform to address race and issues with, you know, negativity towards Black people, you know, systemic racism and so forth. How are these voices helping to address issues like some of the ones I just noted?
You know, I mean, yes, you know, I think it's great what men's male athletes have been doing. Colin Kaepernick especially. I think you get people, we've seen so many more of them speak out more. Oftentimes it's the actions of individuals, though. And that's the one thing that I love about covering these topics when it comes to women's sports, is that, you know, when we look at, you know, the NWSL, whether it's all of them kneeling en masse during the national anthem as they kick off the Challenge Cup, as they did this month, or it's all the way back in 2016, before Colin Kaepernick knelt, where you have the WNBA teams responding en masse to police brutality. You know, I think that is amazing for a couple of reasons. The first is that I think it's so important that we listen to Black women when they speak, number one. But number two is that it's really important cultural work for white athletes to model what solidarity looks like. And that is something that we have not seen in men's sports at all, period. Like, there are a couple of like little instances, but from the beginning of you know, the WNBA taking social action, we saw white players standing in solidarity with their teammates. And when it comes to thinking about what it means to be on a multicultural team, what it means to have solidarity across difference, I feel like the women are light years ahead of the men. They've done so much work around inclusive cultures when it comes to LGBTQ identity, when it comes to racial justice, et cetera, that, you know, what these women are doing, frankly, it's freaking incredible. And I really wish that more credit and attention was paid to the actions they've taken. And I hope that white folks who are looking to be accomplices and allies, and are looking to stand in solidarity with people of color, with queer people, take their cues from what the women who are our athletes are doing.
Before I ask you my last question, I'm seeing all these wonderful comments, everyone. So that we can make sure we try to get to your questions, click on the double icon on the lower part of your Instagram screen. It has a question mark in there. If you click on that, then you can type a question and I can try to read it, because it's going to be hard to read them from the comments. So my last question, and then I'll open it up for some questions from those of you who are tuning in. I read something that you wrote, and you said I think you were working as a coach, or you're working at a college, and you said you didn't feel comfortable putting a photo up of your partner or any type of items that would show that you are from the LGBTQ community. And we know that there's been a landmark ruling in the States from the Supreme Court that provides civil rights law, and protects gay, lesbian, and transgender workers. What implications do you think that will have for the sports community?
Oh man, the implications are wide ranging in terms of what it means to be a queer person in the United States. I mentioned that I grew up in Indiana, and for me, I now live in Connecticut. People ask me, well, would I ever move home? And it's not even a question. I could never do that. It's like, no, I have rights and protections here. Why would I leave? And when that ruling comes down, it just fundamentally changed everything. Suddenly I could move home if I wanted to. I don't, but it puts so much on the table in terms of what it could mean to live a full and healthy and affirming life in the United States as a queer person. And that cannot be understated broadly. I think what it means for sports specifically is that it just opens so many doors. It also provides protections for queer athletes. Just as I felt, I feel somewhat unsafe when I go home to Indiana. I'm sure that there are queer people that play for the Indiana Fever who may similarly have felt that. Protections for everyone means protections for everyone. And that just eases so much anxiety. And what I hope is that it further depoliticizes what it means to be supportive of LGBTQ people, and that gives the sports world permission to re-engage on that issue and to take a strong stand for inclusion in support of their fans and their athletes and their employees.
Well, thank you so much for this discussion. It was so great. I'm hoping that we've got some questions. I'm going to click on my little question box here. I don't see any, but I have seen lots of people adding comments. Everyone loves the comments that you made. That was from See What She Can Do. Professional sport leagues have such a potential to influence fans and their opinions. People take their cues from their favorite teams and athletes and idols. That was from Canadian Women in Sport. I do see a question that's popping up. Give me one session. Sorry, one minute here. You mentioned that basketball was a safe space for you to explore your gender expression. What do you think is about, sorry, I can't see the full question. What do you think it is about the culture of basketball, I guess, that would allow you to feel, that you were in a safe space?
Yeah, I think for me, part of it is actually how we code basketball. I think basketball is a sport that is coded as masculine, which can be limiting for other people. I think for me, it gave me an opportunity to be more expansive in how I expressed my identity. And so, whether that's like, you know, the highlight videos of like, you know, Allen Iverson like stepping over a guy that he shot over, you know, in the finals or whatever. There's just so much masculine expression that's infused in basketball, I think, in a way that allowed for me to have just more room to be myself. What I will say is that when I got into high school, that was not the case. You know, I wrote about this a little bit, being in high school and going back to play. I went to a private school in my hometown, and I went to go back to play against the public school as we did every year. And a bunch of my friends from middle school were there, and like one of them called me a homophobic slur, and like, you know, there was just all kinds of like jawing and chatter during that game, and like how hard that was for me. It was before I came out, and it was at a point where I was almost willing to admit that I was queer, but not quite. And being in such a small town that was not necessarily progressive in any way, that was really hard, and I kind of had my bubble burst a little bit. You know, all of a sudden, you know, whereas it was totally fine to wear tank tops and baggy shorts and, you know, to pretend to be like Michael Jordan, you know, in high school, in the locker rooms, you know, girls were putting on makeup before the games, and I wasn't doing that. And I wasn't really quite sure how to deal with that. And so I found that to be really, really challenging near the end of my playing career. But at the time when I needed it most, it was there. And I think largely it was just because of, you know, how we allow basketball players to dress and look and move, which I think is very different from a sport like volleyball, for example.
Or figure skating.
Yeah, or figure skating. I wouldn't have fared well in figure skating.
And Jillian Svensson, she says, Katie, thank you for always educating and breaking things down. I've appreciated all of your guidance and knowledge over the past 5 years.
Jill's the best.
She is. Let's see what else we can see. Someone clapped at one of the points that you made. I've been clapping in my head at all the points that you've made.
I know. I love when I see the clap emoji. I'm like, yes. Killing it.
Professional sport leagues have such a potential to influence fans. I think I read that one already. That was from Canadian Women's Sport. A fundamental from Nadia Flam from CBC Toronto. A fundamental sexist assumption. What a great point. Honestly, hadn't thought of it that way. And yet now that you verbalize it, so true. Thank you. I think that was when you were talking about transgender athletes that we see in the news. Such a good point about compulsory femininity and masculinity being embedded in the culture of different sports. So we had lots of great, Jennifer Fernandez, sport along with the Olympics have a long way to go into respecting modern gender identity. So everybody is clapping and doing the emojis of support for you. You know, I've been following you for a while, reading some of your articles on ESPN.com. I love the power of online and finding the internet, because this is how you can connect with people, even if we don't live in the same city. So thanks again for the talk. I don't think I see any more questions, guys. I think everybody was so excited, or I should say, anyone's questions, everyone. I see everybody just adding comments. Anyone else?
Oh, Jill has a question.
Jill. Oh, it's just popped up right now. She just got one in there. Oh, there's two. Let me just see. I see one from See What She Can Do. What kind of stories and sport content would you like to see more of around queer athletes?
I mean, so many stories. I think for a long time we were focused on telling coming out stories. That was like the thing that you did around queer people. And there, like, for the most part, there are very, very few of those stories that are out there now that I would consider to be like really newsworthy. As somebody who works at a national outlet, of course, like all stories are valid and are very important. I'm not minimizing that. But when it comes to queer folks, you know, I think in sport, like, queer people live full and affirming lives, and I want to read about all of it. You know, I got to do this little article on Elena Deladon's wedding, and it was one of my favorite things I've ever done. Just celebrating this person that, you know, was getting married. And yes, she's marrying a woman, but like, you know, it was just like really fun and really exciting, and I loved that. You know, there are stories that we could do about queer people with nothing to do with them being queer.
Just being people.
Yeah, just being people. But like there are little things that I think are really great, you know, and this seems so insignificant. But like in the WNBA, there is so much possible drama that does revolve around relationships. Like that's a real thing. And the way that we talk about sports, it is relationship driven, right? So like KD leaving Oklahoma City for Golden State and going back to play against Russ is like a big relationship driven story. I would argue that Courtney Vandersloot leading the league in assists where she gets to pass the ball to her wife half the time is also a relationship driven story. Mm-hmm. And it's really exciting to see those relationships acknowledged more and be a part of the fabric of how we tell the stories about these sports. Because like, I remember I was watching a Chicago Sky game and I have wondered, I'm like, well, they're very open now. You know, they came out publicly, I guess, when they got married. But they're very open about that. You know, it's like the Vanderquigs, like it's a whole thing. And it's a whole thing like online for people that enjoy the Chicago Sky and enjoy the WNBA. And the announcer, Ryan Rucco, like in the middle of the game was like, and Courtney Vandersloot passes it to her wife. And I was like, oh my God, they just acknowledged that like on television. And it was amazing. And like, that's the kind of stuff where it's like, it's factual, it's accurate. Of course it should be included. Like if Courtney Vandersloot played on the same WNBA team as her sister, we talk about that all the time.
That's true. Siblings,
so like,
yep.
Why can't we talk about that when it comes to relationships, when it comes to breakups, when it comes to divorces and marriages? Like there's so many things that happen in the WNBA. And I'm really pleased that we've moved toward a place where the players are more comfortable with that being out in the open and discussed. The commentators are more comfortable with that being out in the open and discussed. And so are journalists. I think it creates a really rich content, just really rich content from which to farm. And I'm pumped about it. I love it. Give me all the drama.
Jillian has a question, and, you know, she says, how do you feel about women's sports organizations that have she or her in their name? I mean, we're She's for Sports, but we also, you know, open the door, and we're very inclusive in the sense of telling the stories, not just of women and girls, but those from diverse groups. And, you know, if it's LGBTQ plus, and that's a diverse group, we have been doing that. So, but it is an interesting question. So how do you feel about women's sports organizations that have she or her in the name? Does it reinforce the gender binary, or is there a space for it? I think it's a great question.
It's a great question. It's a hard question. You know, of course, my perspective is somebody who is non-binary, who's assigned female at birth. And so whenever I see an organization that serves in a women's space that is labeled with she or her, or even just, well, I guess, yeah, we'll say she or her. I do question, I ask myself, is that a space for me? And I think I'm pretty sure I actually asked you that question. And, you know, I understand why folks name their organizations that do serve women with, you know, a she, her pronoun. I don't think it's something that is ever going to end. I don't know if it's something that ever should end. To me, it's about recognizing that in practice that may send a signal that you're more exclusive than you intend to be. But that doesn't mean then that through action you cannot show that you are inclusive. I think it's about values and how those values inform your practice. But then also, you know, it's a question of, is it possible to have a more inclusive name? And I don't know how I feel necessarily about that. Or if if I would advocate for banning the use of, she, her pronouns in all names. I don't know. But I do think that inherently, of course, it reinforces the gender binary, by definition. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it shouldn't exist, if for no other reason than for the majority of people in the world, well, at least in the United States, the gender binary is a perfectly acceptable thing. So I don't know how I feel. I go back and forth. I'm clearly very conflicted. I know it's not a great answer. But I do think that if you have inclusive values, you should live through them all the time and demonstrate those values through action. Yeah, that's what I think.
Yeah, I love that answer, because I know we spoke before this chat, and you got to learn a little bit more of my values and our vision for She's for Sports and what we were trying to do. I really love that you underscored action. You know, I'm not going to, you know, sit here and finger point different sports organizations, but there are a lot of people that aren't doing much, right? Mm-hmm. When it comes to being inclusive and having those voices and representation in you know, some of the initiatives or their marketing, or if they're looking for a fitness person to be a part of their online sessions. Like, you know, we're at a place now where people are really holding people to the fire, their feet to the fire, to say, you know, where is the action? So I'm glad that you outlined that. I don't see any more questions. Anybody, is there another question before we say goodbye to Katie? I'm scrolling. I don't see any more, but I mean, these were all great questions. Thank you for this live, How She Hustles. Emily Mills at How She Hustles. Thank you for this live. I can't wait to watch the replay from the start. Yeah, and we're going to be asking you, all of you who are tuning in and those who may tune in the future, is 9 o'clock a good time? As I said from the start, we kicked off our We Are Sports series with Katie Barnes. We will be speaking with other people who are from the BIPOC sports community throughout July to September. So stay tuned for all of our updates and who else we're going to be talking to next. Our next IG Live is July 22nd with Christina Logbo, a world champion water polo athlete, and also Marcy Spencer, an Olympian and a Canadian boxer. So we've got lots of people lined up for you guys, lots of great conversations. Again, this series is a partnership with Canadian Women in Sport and our funding partner, Sport Canada. Katie, it was great speaking with you. If anyone wants to reach out or find out what you're doing, where else can they find you?
Well, you can follow me on Twitter at Katie_Barnes3. I believe I'm the same on Instagram. And yeah, it's best places to find me, and then look out for my work on ESPN. Thanks so much, Katie. We will be posting the recording of this video, this IG Live, tomorrow. But again, as I said, let us know what all of you are tuning in. What did you like? Is there anyone in your sports community who is from the BIPOC group who you think maybe we should have them on a panel, or we should be speaking to them? Let us know, and stay tuned for more information on our next IG Live and our Zoom panel. Also, Canadian Women in Sport will be doing a Zoom panel to further this discussion on, I believe, July 29th. So check it out on shesforsports.com, and we'll keep you posted as to what else is coming up with us. Katie, thanks so much for the talk, and we'll be in touch. Good night, everyone. Okay, bye-bye.